It's a very complex and convoluted case that we've covered in detail here at Nooganomics.com and at Nooga Radio. And it could be a break, though, because it would give cover for the mayor to say, well, okay, we're satisfied with this report. An independent engineer has looked at this property. We do not have reason, seeing this report, to be concerned further for the public safety and welfare, and we drop our litigation against this family. And Thomas and Carol Gaddy may come out of hiding. They have to meet the judge, though, to get clear of the contempt finding. That's where the law stands, or the legal battle stands. They were declared in contempt, and so they fled to avoid arrest. They're in their 60s and 70s and fear that jail would be death to their old bones. And so the engineers report that in a letter dated July 27 is a new development, favorable development in that case. Let's see if the attorneys and the Gaddys and their son might make the best of it. David Tulis here. We have a larger, that's a housing fight, if you will, in the Chattanooga area in Dunlap, but there's a housing fight all across the country, and the fight is between the free market and HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, overseen by its new secretary, Ben Carson, and a local independent businessman, John Hannity, who runs an important research organization and think tank called Sustainable Freedom Lab. It has been in Washington. In fact, he got back just yesterday from a conference there just outside Washington in Arlington, Virginia, the American Dream Coalition Conference. And the question is HUD, this vast behemoth with a pretended claim of jurisdiction over housing in all the states, and billions of dollars to spend. And John, what you're there dealing with the administration? You have an argument to make with the Trump administration. What in general are you saying to officials in the Trump administration? John Hannity.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on. Well, we are very fortunate in that I am able to work with and share information with the administration, and this has been very helpful to get the word from local communities back really into the heart of where change can be made. And one of the things that they need to understand is that many of the requirements that the federal government has, especially through housing and urban development with programs like their affirmatively furthering fair housing, tend to commandeer what local communities can do with land use and zoning laws, and that ultimately affects the price of housing. One of the biggest observations we had is there's simply not enough affordable housing in America today, and it's actually decreasing. While there's more housing going up, the need for it is increasing. So the result is there's tens of thousands of families, hundreds of thousands of families who need to be able to afford homes, and they can't do that, and there's no place for them either to buy or to rent. So we have to look at what are the underlying causes, and in many cases, the people who say they want to cure the problem are actually creating the problem. We had an excerpt from this is a builder out in Seattle, Washington. Now, her name is Martha Rose, and she was not there, but an article she had written was presented. And that Martha Rose is a fascinating person because she's what they call a greenie. In fact, she has a nickname of the Queen of Green. She's a builder. She builds sustainable housing in King County, Washington, which is where Seattle is. She also is I think the director of the Housing Association out there in King County. So she's quite a known person. She wrote an article in which she said, and I'm going to quote from the article. I got a photocopy of it, a photo of it. Let me reiterate this. The town councils, the planning departments and development departments, the departments of transportation simply refuse to accept responsibility for their roles in the rising costs of building. They simply don't care that design reviews also add layers of costs, and they seem oblivious that fees associated with existing and new rules add additional costs. These are, besides the shortage of buildable lots, these are the three items are the number one reason why housing prices are becoming so high. So really, the very people, even locally and in Washington, are passing so many regulations, so many developmental requirements, so many urban planning designs that limit what you can and can't do, that exercise growth containment policies, densification. These all tend to drive the cost sometimes as high as 30%, in other cases even more, and that makes them unaffordable. We had a member of the Home Builders Association who said that for every $1,000 you raise of the cost of the house, 202,000 people can no longer afford to buy that. That's National Association of Home Builders. And this is a pretty frightening cost, cost factor, because when you think that you're adding maybe $5,000, $10,000 the cost of a house, look at how many people you're pricing out of the market and will never be able to buy that. In some cases, they can't even be rented out enough to cover a purchaser's cost. So if you have an investor who buys the house, he's often stuck with something that it can't get sufficient rents for, or it has to charge so much that it no longer helps the low-income community that so desperately needs that. So we spent a great deal of time on things like, what can we do to change the models so that we can have more affordable housing? Do these transportation schemes, do these urban developers, urban planners schemes, do they really accomplish getting people better, improving the standard of living of people? Because that's what we're really trying to do. The ultimate goal is to get people out of poverty and improve the quality of life. So do they do that?
Well, it seems,
for the most part, they don't.
Well, John Anthony of Sustainable Freedom Lab, it seems that the people who are passing these rules and wanting these design controls and so on have, in one way, they have an aesthetic ideal. They want things to look nice. They want things to look pleasant, middle upper class. And they forget that if you're going to allow for an unregulated and junky neighborhood with cheap rents and cheap flats, that may not look good. It may not suit your sensibilities, but that's what poor people need. They need to have places that are not well maintained, that are not well built necessarily, because that implies a lower price, one that they can afford. And you're saying those kind of cheaper headquarters that may not look great, may be maybe eyesores, but we need to have those if poor people are going to have a place to rent or to buy.
Yes, we had a designer. His name was Elaine. Oh gosh, and I do forget his last name. I have my notes, but I tell you, I just got back in late last night, and I didn't have a chance to organize everything. But brilliant planner from Paris, and he was able to share some information with us. For years, and this is addressing exactly what you're saying, David. For years, we've operated on these this monocentric model for urban planning, where you kind of had a center that was a hub, like New York City, and everybody would kind of like, get trains and rails and so on and so forth into the city, and then they go home again. Well, that's begun to change as these centers begin to move around. So suddenly we came up with these dispersed methods of urbanization. But the big point is, urban design, successful urban design, has always followed the marketplace. It's been a response to market demands. It's never been the reverse. And that's what these planners are trying to do. They're trying to say, well, this is what your city is going to look like. For instance, you see a lot of urban villages beginning to come up, stem up in plans throughout Rhode Island, other parts of the Northeast, down in Maryland, and on the West Coast. And this is where you have, and even in Atlanta, you see this starting to spring up. There's an idea there called Wake Up, Walk Up Atlanta, which essentially creates these little urban villages. You got the center, which is Atlanta, then maybe you'll have like Marietta, Georgia, but that'll be like the self-contained little village there where you'll have your walk-up communities, you walk up banks, you can walk to transportation and to your jobs and so forth. The problem with that concept, it sounds great on paper and it looks beautifully designed, but it does not successfully exist anywhere on the planet. There's no place in the world where that's succeeded. So we're running into a situation where the planners are trying to design what our future looks like instead of following the needs of the marketplace and then responding to that. So that's one of the things that we're promoting. Now, we were very fortunate that we had, this was sponsored by Randall O'Toole. If you don't know his name, he's just a wonderful person to look up. He's written numerous books on development and housing and particularly transportation. He's from the Brookings Institute. He kind of sponsored this whole thing. Randall O'Toole and Wendell Cox is an international demographer. He has a website called demographia.com. Demographia.com. I urge people to look at that because he does studies of housing prices around the world every year. He releases a new study. And he looks at what he calls the multiple median. And that is, what's the median income of the people living in, say, Chattanooga? and what's the multiple cost, the median income of the price. And there shouldn't be more than a 3 times difference. So if the median income is $50,000, then the median price of the house ought to be around $150,000. And once it goes above that, we now reach unaffordability. And for years, homes have been in that 3-to-1 margin ratio until after World War II, when all of a sudden prices began to skyrocket. After the Levittowns came along, after they began to die out, prices started to rise. You now go to San Jose, California, you're talking 7, 8, 9 times the median income. So even a teacher living there can't afford to buy a home in San Jose, California. They have to come in from outside to be able to afford that. Here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and down in Atlanta, we see the harbingers of this type of thing starting to form. Atlanta has that Atlanta Regional Council. Regional councils are somewhat frightening because they establish this kind of artificial geography. They'll use a geography as the outline of what the jurisdiction should look like. So they create this non-jurisdictional geographical region that might follow a watershed, let's say. And then they establish a non-elected council. They may be public officials, they may be Chamber of Commerce officials, but nobody was elected to that role. They then decide what the design ought to be for the community, and that's where you get these crazy urban village developments and these various designs that ultimately cost a lot of money. They love to bring in light rail transit lines, which essentially lose money almost everywhere they are. There's only 6 light rail transits in the country that are actually paying for themselves. Everything else loses money and becomes a drain on the economy. In Denver, Colorado, they have bus rapid transit, and they said, well, this was going to be our answer to get back and forth to the Denver airport, which is like 40 miles outside of Denver, and Littleton and all these little communities outside of it can travel better, more effectively, if we put these bus rapid transit lines in. The problem is nobody was using the bus rapid transit, or not nobody, but very few riders were using them. So what did the town council do? What did the regional council do? They decided to darken the windows on the buses so nobody can see how many people are riding on them. And that's starting to become habitual. More communities are saying, well, we're not going to let the public know that these things have to be subsidized, so we're just going to darken the windows so you don't realize there's only 4 passengers on the bus today. So there's all these things drive up costs, and that makes it simply unaffordable to build. It makes it difficult to build low-income housing and unaffordable for low-income families to be able to afford that housing. So I'm fortunate, as I said, to work with the administration. We're recommending solutions, mainly to back off on a lot of regulations and to get rid of, we want them to rescind this affirmatively furthering fair housing, because all the concepts that I just told you, of being able to walk up to a bank, being able to have access to a better school or better transportation lines. Under AFFH, if you take community development block grant money and home money, which I think Chattanooga's taken both, they have the authority to come in and say you're discriminatory if low-income families don't have the same access to that transportation line or that better school as your wealthier communities do. And you can be sued into compliance if you don't start building homes where they want you to build them. That's absolute centralized control, and it's taking discrimination beyond anything that's ever written in the Fair Housing Act. So we're fighting to have that removed to give more authority back to the states. Another thing that I've done personally, I'm working with I'm very fortunate to work with some very high-level politicians and business people in Greenville, South Carolina. And we're also looking here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We have some meetings to get something started here. I have a program called the Miss Mary Project, like Mary Had a Little Lamb, MissMaryProject.org. We're a 501c3, and what we do is we work with local community members, including tenants organizations and churches, and we identify working-age members of low-income families who have the desire to get better jobs and make better money. We're not talking just enough to get yourself out of above the poverty level. We're talking about having a good job where you make a serious amount of money and you're qualified for advancement in the job, and you get good positions. Now, this is working. Another model of this is working up in Wisconsin. I spent some time up there with Senator Ron Johnson and some other folks, and they had a great model. We've patterned ours after that, and we've taken it to the next level. So I think this is going to be exciting. And the bottom line purpose is to get more people out of poverty, and also to reduce the necessity to have HUD. We take all this money in because we have to build these affordable houses, which have then become no longer affordable. So, and then we need more and more tax subsidies. So what we are trying to do is require less of the dependence on HUD. And the program that we've started here, we think we're looking right now. We don't actually have a timeline laid out yet, but we're looking at going national, and we'll have this in major cities in every single state in the United States. And if we can do that, we can take the poverty level, which has been between 11 and 15% since 1965. Our goal is to reduce the poverty level in America to below 10%.
This is David Tulis, and we're talking with Sean Hannity, who runs in Ottawa, Sustainable Freedom Lab. And let me ask John, the interest level in the administration, the Trump administration, his agency headed by Ben Carson, what is the interest level in these freedom-oriented libertarian ideas? Is it strong? Is it just interest for show, or is there genuine care for how the markets work and how the markets could replace lumbering bureaucracies?
There's a genuine care for it, but the voice is muffled. And that's what we're trying to change. There's a lot of staffers and career folks in there who don't want to change anything. They want to keep things exactly the way they are. Then you might say they're political. You might say they're not political. Whatever. I don't want to label that. But they certainly have a specific cause, and they think the only way to help low-income families, I'm talking specifically of HUD, the only way to help low-income families, HUD and the Department of Transportation and Department of Education, that the only way to help these people is through government subsidies. And what they like to do is add the subsidy amount to what they make in the form of income, and therefore say they're no longer in poverty, which is absurd. That's like saying, I live in poverty, but the guy next door keeps giving me a $2,000 loan every month, therefore I'm not in poverty anymore. So this is not a working model that's successful, and one of the things we have to do is convince the people who populate these federal agencies with a new vision, that people can pull themselves out of poverty. We're not saying by any stretch that you have to eliminate HUD and you don't need a net. Of course you need a net. Nobody's suggesting that you don't need some kind of a net for people. But part of the role of all of these agencies has to be to get people off of that net on their own 2 feet and become financially independent. So we've identified programs within organizations like HUD that actually do that very well, but they're underutilized. In fact, nobody even pays attention to them, and they're considered failures. But they have tremendous possibilities to succeed. So we're trying to change the thinking. We're also exposing some of the surveys that HUD has done. HUD has done some work over the years where they've had programs that have failed, and they've got reports showing that their own reports showing that they've failed, but then they come back several years later, maybe a decade later, and rework the reports, find something in there that was successful, and they say, because of that successful point, we're going to advance and keep promoting more of this, say, Move to Opportunity program, where we shuffle people from one area to another so they'll be more successful. They completely ignore all the parts of the survey and report analysis that show that they do more damage than they do good. So we're trying to educate people within HUD. We're trying to take the message about free market role in helping people to get out of poverty, the free market role as a guidepost for what urban development should look like, and implant that directly into the administrative heads throughout these various federal agencies. We're trying to be the bridge so we get past that muffled voice that I mentioned earlier.
John Hannity, how can my listener find out more about Sustainable Freedom Lab? What's the website, and what can you do to help?
Look, there's 2 sites I would love for people to go to, and please just check it out. There's Sustainable Freedom Lab. That's lab, like laboratory. SustainableFreedomLab.org. And if you check out there, there's a host of information about HUD. There's articles. There's a section called the HUD Toolbox. Click on that, and you'll see all kinds of original documents. There's no guesswork or opinions here. This is the real stuff. So go there and find out what's going on inside HUD. The other thing I would appreciate, we have started the Miss Mary Project.org. You can find that online. We just set a website up like 2 days ago. MissMaryProject.org.
MissMaryProject.org.
How we help.
Well, John Hannity, thanks so much for joining us. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's actually a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
This is David Tulis. We've been talking with John Anthony. Make sure you check out sustainablefreedomlab.org. That's John's website for his very excellent group here in Chattanooga, very free market oriented, understanding how the markets work and trying to interface with this gigantic federal bureaucracy, HUD, with its new head, Ben Carson. David Tulis.
In-depth traffic, news, and information. Mornings on Nooga Radio, AM 1240 and 92.7 FM.